I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, and we've decided to do a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. Why that title? Well, several years ago, I heard Rachel Barko give a presentation at the University of Minnesota, and she said that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And that got me to thinking, why? Why does the criminal legal system not work to keep us safe? And what will keep us safe? That's what we're going to talk about on the podcast, that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform or changes or advancement, that those things we are trying to do here at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office will bring us public safety. So Rachel Barko will be our first guest on our very first podcast, and then you'll hear from experts in the field about what does actually work. Join us. Thank you, Rachel, for joining me in this conversation. When I was thinking about the idea of a podcast, part of it came from me having been in office as the Hennepin County Attorney for 2 years now. And what I often hear is that there's public safety and then there's whatever I'm doing over here. And anybody else kind of trying to reform or change the system as though they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And so what we were thinking about was the idea of you don't have to choose, that actually what we're trying to do with reform and change is public safety, and it is to make the public safe. But I think first we have to talk about why the system doesn't keep us safe. And there's no more expert in that than you. And I say that because you were here at the University of Minnesota Law School years ago, I think at a symposium. And it might have been about the time your book, Prisoners of Politics, came out. And you made a statement that's always stuck in my head. It was that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. So what I really want to do is spend our time together unpacking that. But the first thing I want to do is to have you introduce yourself a little bit. I know you graduated from Northwestern and then Harvard Law School. You are currently, because I wanted to get this right, the Charles Seligson Professor of Law and the Faculty Director at the Zemas Center on the Administration of Criminal Law at NYU School of Law. Tell us a little bit about your work and your career trajectory.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation for sure. So my career, when I went to law school, I'll start there and say that kind of from the beginning, I was always really interested in this idea that we had this separate concept of there's criminal law and how you administer that on the one hand. And then we had all these regulatory agencies on the other. And, we were evaluating them with judicial review and we were making sure they weren't doing things that were arbitrary and capricious. And it was all this oversight and cost benefit analysis. And I never could quite wrap my mind around why they were two separate things. I know they were two separate subjects in law school. If you go to law school, you take administrative law and you take criminal law and, never the two shall meet. And that always struck me as weird. And then, when I started practicing and my husband began his career as a prosecutor and I was doing more administrative law, the contrast again would kind of always just shock me, really. Like he would have this authority to do things and always with good faith and in the best interest, but like no accountability in terms of like, is what you're doing working? Does any of this, could it be better? Does it make any sense? So that's been kind of the motivating question of my research agenda as a legal scholar, is just trying to make sure that when we administer criminal law and punishment in America, that we hold it up to the highest standard, that we make sure when we do it, we're actually being effective, that we're not being discriminatory, that it works to keep us safe, that we take the most cost-effective approaches. All the things we would do when we were evaluating any other agency, I believe we should do when we evaluate prosecutors or sentencing commissions or any other agency that administers criminal law or punishment. So that's kind of my backstory. That's why it's always it's been of interest to me. And, most of my scholarship in some way, shape, or form kind of gets around that basic question of how could we get better results from the way we administer crime enforcement and punishment in America.
So you use a phrase I use all the time too. It's we, meaning people here in this country, have been sold a bill of goods forever, pretty much about the criminal system and public safety. Do you have thoughts about why the effectiveness of it has never really been interrogated? Why people haven't insisted on the same kind of accountability that you would see in a private corporation or something else?
Yeah, I think that one of the major differences between the kind of the way we view other areas in criminal law is people feel like they are experts in criminal law and punishment. People just have their own gut sensibility. Like, of course, there's a bad guy, you lock the bad guy away, done. We don't need an expert to tell us how to do that. We don't need to evaluate that. That's just what you do. Whereas I think if it's a subject like, clean water, that's a little different. Like, what's the particulate matter in water? How do you make sure there's not lead in the pipes? That seems like something that does require a level of expertise and evaluation to make sure you're doing things in the most cost effective, scientifically sound way. And I think it's that failure to see that there actually is expertise and data and information about the administration of punishment regimes that people don't really, I think, intuitively necessarily get. And I think because people have these gut instincts about what works and what doesn't, they don't feel a need to study it or have somebody tell them. But in fact, actually a lot of what we do that we think is right as a matter of gut instinct, as it turns out, is counterproductive and not good for public safety. So we really should do the same kinds of things for the administration of crime and punishment that we do for the other areas. But I think that's the main reason for the disconnect, is just this kind of sense. It's criminal law is about moral judgments. If someone does something bad, they should be punishment, end of story. And I think, what I would hope people would say is, that's true. That's definitely part of what we do with criminal law. But we do have a goal. I mean, I think our major goal is to make sure that we achieve public safety to the maximum extent that we can. Like, I think everybody agrees that's what we want to do. Like, how do we do that? And there actually are studies on that. There actually is information that we could use. And the important thing is to just remember that if it may be that in a given case, someone has a moral intuition and they say, you know what, I don't care if it's bad for public safety. I want to do this anyways. I'm so angry at this person. I don't care. And I think there probably are some crimes like that, to be perfectly honest with you. But in the main, I think what we should want to do with how we prosecute people and enforce criminal law and punish is to make sure we're getting good results. And for that, you should look at the information that's out there and at least make an educated decision. If you want to discard it all because you decide you have other values that are more important, that's one thing. But if you're just not even looking at it, you're not even saying, oh, this is a trade-off I'm making, that I think is a mistake. I think everybody should want more information rather than less.
And if I could jump on that too, I hear you talking about maybe a moral decision about punishment. And sometimes what I hear, I talk a lot about accountability, which is very different than punishment. And to me, accountability has, well, it has a lot of different factors. But sometimes what I hear from people is, but, for instance, it's a terrible crime. There has to be punishment. And it sounds like you do have some thoughts about how we frame this. We can certainly talk about punishment. If I'm hearing you correctly, we can certainly talk about punishment, but we have to acknowledge we are actually talking about punishment. We are not talking about whether the system is effective to keep people safe.
Yeah, I mean, punishment can do that. I guess it depends what you mean by punishment, right? So there's punishment just for, I guess, what some people might think of as punishment's sake, or what, philosophers would talk about. It's retributive justice. It's like, we're just making sure that someone gets their just desserts. They did something bad and they deserve, because they were blameworthy, some harmful thing to happen to them. Can
I jump in on that and differentiate between incapacitation and punishment? Because I think you're absolutely right there. And I see this probably every day. There are some people who are not safe in the community. And so they need to be, at least in our judgment, incapacitated so that they aren't harming other people. So that is true. Is that also a different concept than punishment?
Yeah, so I guess I would say there's just I think when people speak about it in everyday terms, punishment maybe as is like a big umbrella term that is like the consequences for the hard treatment, the negative thing that's going to happen to you that you deserve because of the bad thing that you have done. And it can be done for different purposes though. Like we could punish for different reasons. So, and it can take different forms, right? Punishment doesn't have to be incarceration. Punishment could be some other negative thing that happens to you. It could be you have to pay a fine. It could be that, you have to own up to the thing that you have done that you don't want to own up to. And you have to make amends, or you have to do something else that, you're not happy about. So really, I think that any of those things could be considered to be punishment, and they could be done for any number of reasons. So we could do it because we want to express our disapproval as a society. We want to use a negative consequence to say, look, you can't do this with impunity. We want to show that we care about this issue. And the way we show we care about a victim or a bad thing that happened is to punish the person who did it. So it can be expressive. It can be done for deterrence. We could say, look, if we don't punish this person who just did this thing, then everybody else out there who's thinking about doing it, they're going to go ahead and do it. Or even this very person, if we don't punish them this time, they're going to go ahead and do it again because they face no consequences. So it could be those forms of deterrence. It could be incapacitation, as you say. For incapacitation, then it has to be a specific kind of punishment. You usually can't incapacitate someone with just a fine. I guess you could if you bankrupted them and that was fraud or something. But typically what we mean by incapacitation is, we're usually thinking about violence, that someone poses a risk of violence to another person. And therefore they need to actually have their liberty constrained. So they need to be incarcerated. And that can be a purpose of punishment too. But it's important to think about, there's all these different purposes. So we could be doing it, like I say, for deterrence, for incapacitation, for expressive purposes, and just, for just kind of pure retributive justice, just as a matter of, look, like this person just deserves this thing to happen because they did this bad thing to other people. So those are all the things we could think about. When we're doing it, though, if the reason that we're doing it is something beyond just how it feels to express the punishment or to make sure the person gets if we're doing it to achieve a particular end, and that end is public safety. If we're saying, look, we have to punish people so that we're all safe, we have to incapacitate someone so we're all safe. We have to deter people so they don't commit it again so we're all safe. That's the one that is really subject to analysis to say, is the kinds of things we're doing, the kinds of punishments we're using, do they work to actually keep us safe? That's something that can be tested and looked at and evaluated. What you can't really look at and test and evaluate in the same kind of way is the moral sensibility. Like if someone just says, look, I just have to do this because I am so angry at this person, they just deserve it, and I don't care if it leads to public safety benefits or not. I want to do it anyways. And that is, I guess, the kind of key divide is you just want to be thinking about what is it you're doing when you prosecute and you punishment and you want to impose some kind of sanction or consequence on a person. If you're doing it to achieve public safety, then you really should be looking at what we've learned about what does in fact make us safer versus what doesn't. And if it's just like, I'm just so angry, then at least know that sometimes when you impose a really harsh sanction, sometimes it backfires. And so it's the question of, whether you're satiating that desire that you have is worth it if it means in the end that like this person, you're going to incapacitate them for 10, 20 years. But you know what? When they come back out, they're actually not going to be in great shape when they come back out to reintegrate into society. And so you might have created a greater danger than if you dealt with the problem in a different way. And that's the kind of trade-off I have in mind.
So let's talk about public safety. How do we know that the system, as we've known it, the criminal legal system, doesn't keep us safe? It doesn't live up to the promises that we've all been told.
Yeah, so I guess I would start with what are called recidivism rates, which would be the rate of rearrest. That's usually how we measure it, but it could be conviction rates. But basically, someone who has had a criminal punishment but goes ahead and commits another crime afterwards, right? Because if what we're doing is working, we would think that we wouldn't have too much repeat play because someone would have learned their lesson the first time from the very thing that we did. And in fact, we have sky high recidivism rates in America. 70, 80% recidivism rate within 5 years after someone gets out of prison. I mean, that is abysmal. I mean, I don't know that I would not myself personally keep doing something that had a failure rate of 80%. Like I would back off from that and say, I'd like to do better than 1 out of 5. Is there anything better than that? I mean, if there isn't, there isn't, but there is, and we can talk about that. So one would be recidivism rates. The second thing I would point to of what we're doing isn't really working well is just thinking about how we allocate resources. We have really low clearance rates for solving the most violent crimes and behaviors. So I think when you ask most people, and there are actually studies that support this, there's a kind of rank order of how people view different crimes, right? People view murder as more serious than a drug offense. They view a rape as more serious than a simple assault. And so you can kind of rank crimes in a loose basis and what you find is we're really not very good as a society. Again, the we would be almost every urban area in the country, every jurisdiction has very low clearance rates for solving the most violent crimes. Homicide clearance rates in lots of places hover around 50% chance of solving that homicide. And so when you think about that, that's like a coin flip as to whether or not if you commit a murder, you're actually going to face any punishment for it. So that I would say is another metric that would tell us that's not great. We should have better results when it comes to solving homicides, making sure the people who commit those things are held accountable. And
Can
in
I
so,
jump? Yeah,
oh,
can
please
I
do,
jump in
please
on
do.
that? That's a great that's a great point because one of the things that was happening here, and it happened across the country, is so car theft went way up and kind of morphed into carjacking, that kind of thing. And what I found in my 2 years here, people will say to us at the county attorney's office, why it's your fault that this continues. And one of the things we looked at was the data and the clearance rates. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what a clearance rate is, but in general, as we've been looking at it here with car theft, given the number, and car theft, I think is a good one to talk about because car theft and murder, unfortunately are the two types of crimes that do get reported, murder obviously, but car theft because people want to report it to their insurance. So it's a little better reliability in terms of what's actually happening. But so in Minneapolis, for instance, I think there were over 7,500 car thefts year before last. And the clearance rate in Minneapolis was less than 2%. Yeah. And it wasn't, it was a little higher in other places. And I'm guessing it's probably similar across the country. And what we had been explaining to people is, look, a clearance rate. So we can't charge anybody. We can't hold anybody accountable unless we actually get a case submitted to us by law enforcement. They can arrest somebody. They can know who might have done it. But unless they submit a case to us that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, we can't do anything. And so one of the discussions has been about deterrence. And you mentioned deterrence before. My understanding that a big deterrent is the certainty that you're going to get caught. And so that would be one of the reasons why clearance rates, the rate at which police solve cases, if you want to put it that way, get enough evidence to a prosecutor to be able to prosecute it, is huge. Because the higher those rates are, the more somebody who might be tempted to engage in that activity won't, because they believe they're going to get caught.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the certainty that you are going to face a sanction is been found over and over again in studies to be the most important thing. So, if you say to somebody, okay, well, if you get caught for this thing, you're going to get 10 years. The next question someone has is, well, what are the odds I'm going to get caught? And I think too often in America, what we have done is we have kept these clearance rates, solving the crime, catching the person. Those rates have stayed low. And to make up for it, or to try to make up for it, you'll sometimes see lawmakers just keep ratcheting up the sentences to say, okay, well, if we just make the punishment higher, but that is just not how human behavior works. That is not creating a deterrent for people. And we know that from reams of studies. Like you can keep raising the sentence, but if the person's odds of getting caught are low, they're going to keep engaging in the conduct because they're going to tell themselves, I'm just not going to get caught. I'll never face that sanction. So if we wanted better crime prevention, it's absolutely catching more people. And it's not about how much punishment they get, or at least, it matters. I shouldn't say that that doesn't matter, but often we have made sentences longer than they need to be, when what we really need to do is get those odds of detection up higher. That would be the most important thing we could do. And, it's interesting because it doesn't always have to be law enforcement. There's other ways that
Mhm.
that you can make it so people get caught. One of the interesting things when smartphones first came out, I don't know if you remember this, they were getting stolen right and left, until they had these tracking devices in them. And ways that people, so they started, there was less theft as a result. And, similarly, there have been other kind of protective means that people have put on their property that just makes it less likely that the crime occurs in the first place. So there's things we can do to prevent crime, that that don't involve punishment. And then there's also things we could do to try to improve detection, that again would yield better returns than just constantly saying, oh, we should improve, we should increase sentences, and that's the way to do it. So those are two statistics that I think, we know that they're true, in terms of not solving very many crimes, catching the people, and that when people are serving their sentences and come back out again, they reoffend at these super high rates. Those are two red flags right there that I think, anyone, if we hired management consultants to come in, if private equity took over
Mhm.
criminal law, those are the first things they'd look at. They'd say, this is unacceptable. Like, this is an unacceptable kind of result, and we need to tackle this. And the problem is, though, we don't have that kind of accountability, because instead what we have is just, voters kind of just hear what the media and politicians tell them. So, if they're hearing from politicians, that, hey, there's all these carjackings, it's the DA's fault. You need to be able to say, well, wait a minute, like, do we know who's stealing the cars? Like, is there a
Yeah.
policing problem? Is there a problem with the cars? Is there something we could do to try to make
Right.
cars less of an easy target? Is it a parking problem? Is it, there's a whole bunch of questions we could ask when we have a particular crime, to try to figure out, okay, what is the best way to try to address this crime? And I mean, I view where you would fall into this pipeline, any district attorney, comes in pretty late in the process, actually, in terms of addressing crime. Like, that wouldn't be, I think, any sound society's first order of business would be like, how we're going to solve crime. Let's go talk to the prosecutor. You have an important role to play, but there's all kinds of steps beforehand that we would want to think about, because we would want to ask ourselves lots of
Yeah.
questions like, why are people committing these crimes in the first place?
Well,
What is it that,
let me throw this at you. And I'm glad you brought up, there are a lot of reasons that it's hard to figure out who's stealing cars, especially since COVID. And we had a lot of young people, they wear a mask, they run away, they flee, that kind of thing. And so my hope has always been to talk about, yes, it is difficult. It's not, as you said, it all shouldn't fall into the lap of law enforcement. We should all be working together to figure out, as you say, what are the issues here? And I don't know that you're aware of this, but when we were meeting with law enforcement in my first year, they used to say to us, we know which kids are involved in this kind of stuff, but we can't bring you a case. We just don't have the proof. And so we said to them, what if we met with you once a week or as often as you want, and you referred the names of those kids to us? We'll run them through our child protection database, our youth prosecution database. We'll have county children's mental health run it through their databases. And we will screen those cases. And if a child is not receiving, or their family is not receiving any kind of services through the county or in the system, we will have, and at the time we started it, one of our social workers reach out to the family and say, hey, your kid's on the radar screen, can we help? And when it first started, and law enforcement was thrilled about it. They're so happy about its success. Actually, they're asking us to expand it from car theft. But the wonderful thing about it is that those kids and their families get referred to community-based services and services through the county, where they can, and our social worker said when he reached out to families initially, caretakers, they were never surprised that their kid was on the radar, and they said, please help. We just don't know what to do. We pulled data from that after starting that program. We pulled data after about a year, and 81% of those young people had not been referred to us, re-referred to us. And that number has gone down a little bit. We know car theft has gone down here in Hennepin County. I think there are a number of factors that could be attributed to that. But one of the things that I'm proud of is, as county attorney, looking at this job also as outside the traditional role. What can we do? I mean, if I've talked to so many victims now, I often think, why am I here apologizing for something I can do nothing about when we probably could have prevented it had we put our resources in other places? So I do think we have a big role in prevention while that is not being done in other places. So I just wanted to throw that out there as something, a tool that we have used, which has been pretty successful here.
I think that's amazing, and that's so great that that takes a lot of initiative on your part, and really does have you going outside what would be the traditional lane of a prosecutor to problem solve and go make that. And so I applaud you for doing it. I think it's fantastic, and I think you definitely get credit for that. And I guess what I would say though is you just really shouldn't get the blame when those services aren't being administered, because like you don't fund those things, you don't administer, you try to facilitate it. But I do think sometimes prosecutors get the blame for various public safety things when a lot of it is just outside their control. I mean, there's things you can control and there's things you can be held accountable for, but I think it's important to make sure that the public understands, like, the prosecutor can't provide housing for people. So if you've got a lot of problems that revolve around unhoused people, there's just a limit to what you need to also be holding other actors in your city and community accountable for things. And I guess just one other reflection on the example you gave that I think is helpful to think about is, you had mentioned it was young people who were stealing the cars. And so, everything we know about what deters crime, when it comes to young people, it's even more so that long punishments are not registering with them, because, anyone who has a teenager, as I do, or has been around one, you understand they're not really thinking in the long term, right? They're not really, they're kind of thinking about immediate things. And there's all kinds of brain science that backs this up. This isn't even just qualitative studies. There's scans in their brain. You can see the part of their brain that hasn't fully yet grown and developed. And it's the part of the brain that assesses risk and thinks about long-term consequences. And is also about, like, kind of group activity, how susceptible they are to peer pressure. So all of that is like a perfect storm in the young mind that makes them, they're more likely than adults would be to kind of yield to all those temptations. And they are not going to, say, oh, wow, the sentence for this went from 10 years to 20. I'm not going to do it. Like, no one in their right mind should think that's going to work. So, if what you're trying to deal with is a juvenile crime issue, you really do need to be thinking about, okay, I need to be able to make sure that I am finding them, that they are going to be detected. That should be, kind of priority one, and then figure out, why are they doing this thing? And are there ways that I can stop it? And again, that's public safety. That is, when you deal with it that way, that you are thinking about public safety. What doesn't work is to say, okay, well, now I'm gonna make it a 40-year sentence. And then that one random kid that you catch that did do it, is going to serve a 40-year sentence. They would have aged out of that criminal behavior. At a certain point, they're going to be serving probably 20, 25 years, 30 years longer than they needed to be, maybe more. And you're not deterring anybody else because no one else thinks they're going to get 40 years. And so you've just created this kind of, really, like, bad luck for the one person who found themselves caught, and you're not actually making a dent on public safety. And to me, what drives me crazy in America is too often that's what we see. And we would get a better outcome if we tried to figure out, actually, how do we tackle this problem more intelligently than just essentially making it a really bad lottery for a couple people who get caught that doesn't influence anybody else, and make it a more sane, administered framework for dealing with things that will for sure make us all better off, long term, and a way better use of our resources.
I do want to get back to the aging out question, but I was kind of chuckling because I was listening to, we went to Hell's Kitchen last time I was in New York. Have you seen it?
Oh yeah, the play. Yes, there's also The Neighborhood. Yeah,
the musical,
named after the neighborhood. Yeah.
The song, the lyrics are, she's 17 and her brain just don't work. I think should be the theme of a youth symposium of some kind, because that kind of captures what you see with teenagers. So Can you, I mean, I'm pretty sure you would say that how we interact with youth, what we do with them in the system, is it keeping us safer as well? And you mentioned the term age out too. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is like one of those things if anyone was thinking about pursuing a career in criminology and they wanted to learn about crime and deviance, one of the very first things you learn when you study the subject is there's this thing called the age crime curve. And essentially it just means you're more likely to commit crime when you're younger. The kind of peak crime years are, late teens through the late 20s. And then people's propensity to commit crime, it just starts to decline after that. There's some crimes that are exceptions to that, so crimes like fraud, business crime, doesn't follow that same trend because you kind of need to be in a position of employment and access to money in order to be able to engage in your embezzlement. So we have some crimes that don't follow it, but for crimes of violence, your kind of typical street crime, the age crime curve, holds across, countries. And it's certainly in America, it's been true. It's kind of one of those iron rules of social science there that people, when they're younger, because of the brain development that we've now learned about, because of the fact that, you're not good at thinking about risk assessment in the same way as when your brain matures, you do have these peer pressures. And so the result of that is that it is more likely that you're going to see young people, frankly, do stupid things. And I think the question that we have as a society is, look, obviously, when they do harmful things that harm other people and it's serious, there should be consequences. We should think about how we want to deal with it. But I think it's important when you have a young person in front of you to keep in mind that, they're not fully cooked. They're just not the same as an adult. And I think people intuitively get this with their own kids. Like, I think if you have a child, that you see in some moments, it seems like, wow, they're an adult, they're fully functioning. And then you see them do something that like is clearly childlike. They're not making the same calculation that an adult person would make in the same situation. And I think the way our punishment and our crime policy should reflect that is to try to take that into account and make sure that when we're imposing sanctions on someone who is young, that is a mitigator, that they don't fully think about things the same way. I think it affects how long someone should get sentenced. I don't think that someone should be sentenced for decisions they make when they are a kid. I don't think they should get a life sentence, that their whole life is thrown away, no matter how bad the action was. I think it's just, and I think people get this intuitively, at least at some ages. Like, I think no one would say if a 6-year-old, killed somebody, I find it hard to believe that anybody would be like, well, that 6-year-old should get life imprisonment, right? No, they would say, my gosh, it's a 6-year-old. They didn't really fully understand what they were doing. And so the question is kind of just, where do you put that age? When do you kind of understand it? And, that's another one of those gut instincts that people have. I think sometimes people think, well, I'm looking at this person and look how bulky and, they're buff, they're bigger than me, and it's not physical size. It's not physical hormonal development. It's not what the person looks like. It's this brain development. And again, that would be an area that I would say, like, I know you might have a gut instinct, but actually we've learned a lot from brain science. And, this person that's in front of you who might be 6'5", 220, actually, it's still in there. It's still an 18-year-old brain, and they are physically may look one way, but mentally and emotionally they have not developed fully yet into an adult. And I think, a humane punishment regime, and also, again, one that thinks about public safety, because if what you're asking yourself is how long, if we think this person needs to be incapacitated because they've posed a risk to other people, the question would be, well, how long? How long are they a danger? And for a lot of these people, as soon as their brain develops fully, as soon as they get older, there's a eureka moment for them where they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that stupid decision I made as a kid. They would never do it again. And I think as a result of that, you need to think about the kind of punishments you want to impose. If you're throwing away a human being for life because of a dumb decision they made when they were younger, you are incarcerating them for far longer than they need to be if what you're thinking about is public safety and a threat. And they could learn that lesson with far less time. In some cases, maybe no prison time. Maybe they just needed, kind of to have the accountability moment. And there's another intervention that would work. And I think, again, people kind of intuitively get this when they think about either their own children or they think about a person that they're otherwise sympathetic to. I'll just give an example from current events. Is the team of people who are working with Elon Musk. They're in their early 20s, and one of them apparently had posted some pretty racist, awful things on Twitter. And I saw a bunch of conservative politicians say, "Hey, well, I'm kind of just a kid. Don't throw away a kid, for something stupid that they said, at 25."
Mhm.
And as soon as I saw that, I thought, I don't disagree with that, but then don't throw away a kid's
Right.
life because the thing that they did instead of a tweet was, they did a stupid car, they took a car or they did another stupid thing with their friends. It should be the same way we think about it, that, yeah, when you're younger, you say and do things that you wouldn't do when you're older. And therefore, you want to make sure that the law and how we enforce the law reflects our understanding of that.
Sometime, and we've had actually two pretty controversial cases here in my first year of young people committing crimes and what serious crimes and being part of serious crimes. But one thing people would say, well, is my kid knows right from wrong, which I don't think is the issue we're talking about at all. And also, there's a particular type of crime that no one can come back from, including a child. Hear that too. What are your thoughts on those two things that people say frequently?
Yeah, I think people don't realize the situational pressures that kids find themselves in. And again, it's that kind of inability to um, they may know the difference between right and wrong, but in a moment where they're facing a lot of peer pressure, in a world where guns are just too ubiquitous and a stupid decision with a gun that you don't have a lot of time to reflect upon could tragically mean that someone loses their life. But it's still the same basic problem, because if you know that, if you have a child who, because of peer pressure, they all decide to do this stupid thing. Maybe it's insulting another kid where they know better. They know that's not the right thing to do, to make fun of someone else, but they get in an environment where they're with their friends and all of a sudden they're taking part in it. Or, they're being dared, to do a thing as a kind of prank. And it's like they're, especially for younger boys. And there's a question of, is their masculinity going to be questioned if they don't take the dare and do this thing? Will people think that they're weaker as a result? It's not that they don't know right from wrong. It's just, it's harder for them as a young person in the moment to stand up to peer pressure, or for them to think, I'm feeling pressure to do this because I want people to think highly of me, and I want people to think, I'm as brave as they are, and I don't want to be called a coward. And, I'm not justifying what they're doing. They still shouldn't do it, but I think it's a question of understanding the pressures that young people feel. To fit in, to be valued, to not be seen as inferior by their peers. I think, for someone my age, it's hard to look back, but even I can pretty much remember that pretty viscerally, just that mad desire to have people like you and fit in and feel like, you kind of mattered in the world. And you're not thinking in the same way that a rational adult does, that would be like, well, you don't need those friends, then of course don't hang out with them anymore. Don't put yourself in a situation to do it. You can say all those things, but the young brain is just not processing it in the same way that an adult brain does, in the same way that a computer processes information differently than a human being. A young person's brain is just not able to do the computation the same way that we would want to. And it's not to say that when they do something bad, there shouldn't be consequences, but I just don't understand a framework that doesn't take into account the fact that they are younger. And, maybe the way to look at it is just to say, do you view it differently when a fully mature 40-year-old commits a crime versus a 17-year-old? Do you really think they should be treated the same? And for me, the answer is no. I just think the person who is 40 and has the benefit of all the life experience and has the kind of full mental capacity to kind of take it all in is situated differently than the 17-year-old. And so the idea you would punish them the same, to me, doesn't reflect a punishment regime that is really thinking about culpability, because I do think the younger person is less culpable, and what we do for them should reflect that. Now, it doesn't mean it's like a get out of jail free card. I
Mhm.
unfortunately, when young people do serious things, I believe there have to be consequences, because even though deterrence doesn't work as well, it does work some, for them, and because they might need that incapacitation, because there might be a need to do something so that they don't harm somebody else. So I'm not speaking as someone who is an abolitionist and thinks we never need prison or we never need police.
Mhm.
I just think that's a naive view. And unfortunately, given human nature and what leads people to do things, I do think there do need to be consequences for people. But it's got to be relative, and it's got to be relative in a way that reflects each person's culpability. And again, I just think adults and children are different. And I mean, if someone is going to just fundamentally reject that, at the end of the day, I don't know really what else to say. I could show them brain scans. I should show them science. I could say, talk to my kid or anybody else's kid for a while, and I feel like you would get the difference after a bit. But and I think most people do. I think most people do. But I get it. When a terrible crime happens, it's hard not to be angry. It's really hard not to just want to like make that crime not have happened, which you can't do because you can't go back in time. And so the human instinct, I think, is just make somebody pay. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's really important when we do that, that we recognize that it's actually not in the name of public safety; it's in the name of something else, and that it should be it should be proportional to what the person actually did and what they're actually blameworthy for, taking into account things about their life, their age, other factors that may tell us something about their background.
Yeah, and one of the hardest things, well, yeah, I've experienced in this job is that, we've had some 17-year-olds do some horrific things. And then you look at their background, and they did receive some kind of services, although I'm always of the belief that if we had effectively intervened early on, they probably wouldn't be here. But here's where we are, right? And so in Minnesota, we have very few resources for kids. Like we could, as we call it, a certification into adult. But if you state a sentence, there just aren't the intensive resources that a young person would need to keep them safe and the community safe. So we have sent some young people to prison. And that feels terrible. But when, we've done that in situations where it just feels like we don't have any options for public safety. And that young person, because of their circumstances, what they've done, their history, what tools we have available, just isn't safe. But we've also had, one case in particular, which is one of the controversial cases we had, was a case that started before I came into office. And it was a young person who was with another young person. They tried to rob somebody in a car. The person he was with shot and killed the driver of the car. Among the interesting things about it was that he was 15 at the time. And because it actually took many, many years. The juvenile court judge didn't think he should be certified. That was appealed, and it took years up in the appellate court to figure out whether this kid was going to be in adult court or juvenile court. Ultimately, they said adult court. So he was certified. But the fascinating thing that happened was at his certification hearing, they had experts testify about what he would need. And it was something like 2 or 3 years with intensive resources, therapy. It had to be secure. And because it took so long, that's actually what he got. And so when the court finished with his opinion, we're looking at a 20-year-old who's a different person than the 15-year-old, has done pretty remarkably given his traumatic history. It is an effective mentor to others. So he's a completely different young person, which I don't think you'd be surprised at when he came in at 15. And the case was interesting to me because we wanted to stay a sentence. We did end up staying a sentence with support systems in place for him. And for me, the choice became, yes, we could send him to prison, the same as the co-defendant, because his case wasn't appealed, for another 10 years or so. Or we could stay the sentence, and try to surround him with resources to continue the progress that he's made. And in one respect, it seemed pretty straightforward. And I completely understand why the family was angry. They thought he should go to prison. I think they get to feel however they feel. But it was an interesting conversation because I kept thinking, if we really believe in rehabilitation, especially of young people who are 15, this really shouldn't be that hard of a question if we're talking about public safety. If we're talking about it in terms of morality or punishment, then maybe it's a different question. But it was very controversial at the time. But it seemed pretty clear what the appropriate course of action was if we were talking about public safety.
Yeah. And I mean, look how long it took you to have to explain it, right? Once you explained it, it makes perfect sense. But the problem in our political environment is that the counter view is just, you can express that in like 10 seconds. Person
Mhm.
X did awful thing, they should pay, and
Mhm.
the campaign ads, they write themselves. We know this
Right.
from studying prosecutor and sheriff elections and all kinds of other elected offices, that it's also just harder to explain to the public why the approach that you're talking about makes more sense. But it absolutely does, right? I mean, it absolutely does. If what you're thinking about is, okay, first of all, that kid is going to get out, right? Even if the person that, most people do not serve life sentences in America. It's prohibitively expensive, in addition to being, excessively cruel in a lot of these cases because of what they did. But we don't do that. So 95% of the people who go into prisons come back out. And, so that's a little bit of voter short-sightedness. And even frankly, sometimes, people who have been unfortunately the survivors of crimes and been most affected, it's sometimes just worth reminding people this person's not going away forever. They're going to go away for some period of time. And particularly when we're talking about young people, that is not a good formative experience for a young person to go into a prison, because prisons unfortunately house a disproportionate number of people that have various mental health crises, a lot of people that have anger management problems. I mean, obviously, if we stop to think about, okay, why is someone in prison in the first place, we can kind of imagine, all right, this is probably a population that's going to have an overrepresentation of people with anger management issues, and then they're put in an environment, in addition to having underlying mental health conditions, that is often crowded and boring, and where people are fighting to try to kind of maintain their space and make sure they're not themselves a victim of abuse. So it is an environment that is horrible for a young person who is developing. And, you put someone in that situation, they're going to come out and they're going to be angrier than when they went in. That's what they're going to model, what they have learned. That is why we have recidivism rates that are as high as they are when people come out of prisons. And so, there is that would be the case you mentioned is a perfect example of a trade-off, where you have to say, okay, look, if what we care about is public safety, then the path we are currently on is working. This person has gotten help and they are already better. And if we interrupt that by putting them in prison, they're going to be worse and they're probably going to regress to committing another offense. So someone else's family is going to be the victim of this person when they get out of prison. And I can understand why the people who lost a loved one might say, I don't care. I'm just so angry. I don't care. But, as the public, the rest of us, you can't just represent what a victim and a survivor might feel in a given case. It's supposed to be what is in the public's interest. And, the public's interest includes making sure there aren't more victims in the future, or otherwise we're in this vicious cycle where everyone is just, okay, well, I want my pound of flesh now because I'm so angry, but then that person's going to come out and they're no better, and then they're going to harm somebody else, and then they're going to harm somebody else. And so, what we really want to do as a society is everything in our power to stop the cycle. And it's not possible for every person. I will say, I'm not naive. I get it. There are people, it doesn't matter what kind of treatment or opportunities you give them. Unfortunately, they're going to reoffend. There's underlying problems personality wise or otherwise where it won't work. But that is really the minority of people. For most people, the vast majority of people, there are interventions that would stop their criminal activity. And I think that's what government is for. Government is to step back and say, even though you personally are angry, because if all we cared about was that an individual was upset and angry, we could just let everybody be vigilantes and just take care of it themselves. We don't do that for a reason. We want to make sure that there is an actor that's supposed to take into account the public interest, like everybody's interest. It includes for sure the victims and their families,
Mhm.
and we should be listening to them and trying to figure out how can we help them. But that, by the way, also includes things other than punishment. I think one of the things that is really important is to ask ourselves, what do we offer victims and survivors when bad things have happened? If the only thing you can offer somebody is, well, we're going to make someone else go through pain, I actually think that is a pretty terrible menu of things to offer somebody.
Mhm.
And so, part of it is also just recognizing what's in the public interest is, finding a way to stop crime, but then also finding other things we could do for survivors, people who've lost people. What can we do to try to make things better for them? Do they need counseling? If it's a property loss, can we give financial supports? There's other things we could be doing other than saying, okay, we're gonna have this person go to prison. Aren't you happy now? Because honestly, most people, when there have been studies of people who've been survivors of crimes, relatives of victims, they say, like, actually that didn't make them feel better. Like, there's, for some it does, but for a large chunk of people, they wanted something else, and we didn't offer them anything else. And so I think, again, it's all a lot more complicated than just saying, okay, someone commits a bad crime, punishment. But if what you really want is public safety, if what you want to try to do is alleviate the suffering of people who've been victimized by crimes, then you need to do a lot more than just say prison, because it doesn't do a very good job in most cases addressing any of those things.
Yeah, I think back on when I was in court a lot and I would hear victim impact statements. And really, what I heard in every single one of them is questions. What were you thinking? Why did this happen? Also, really wanting a recognition of who their loved one was or who they are and how they changed. And they don't get any of that in this. We don't offer that. Also, in my experience too, people who've been harmed really want this never to happen to anybody else again because they recognize how awful it is. And this circles back to your comment, or what you said about recidivism rates. We are pretty much guaranteeing that if all we're offering is punishment, that will happen. And it's one of the reasons we're exploring restorative practices, and really trying to figure out how do we offer something to people who've been harmed that really meet their needs. Because what we're doing, it does work for some people, I agree, and for other people, it doesn't. And they don't get their questions answered. They don't have while the person is in prison or incapacitated, yes, people are safe, but what happens after that? And I think people, in my experience, especially in this job, when I talk to victims, it's really, this isn't doing anything for me.
Yeah.
It
And it's
really,
a
it
mix,
doesn't feel good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I agree. I mean, I think it's important always to just recognize it's just not one size fits all. It
Mm-hmm.
really is the kind of thing that and I think for too long we've just operated under the assumption it's prison and it's one size fits all. And
Right.
that just doesn't work for everybody. It'll still work for some.
Yep.
It'll still be the answer to some things, but it is not the answer to a lot of things. And it's not the answer to a lot of people's desires who have been themselves victimized of crime. They want something else. And so I think it's just a question of expanding the options, expanding the
Mhm.
menu of things. Again, that's informed by what we've learned and researched to the extent that it's out there and is possible to try to do things that are going to be more effective. Sometimes they're also cheaper. We can save some money. We can use that money to invest in other things that help
Right.
build up people and communities. And so, it's just, I think for way too long, there's just been this tendency that the thing we're going to throw at the problem of crime is prison. And that is not the way lots of other countries do it, and have had better results. And frankly, that's not even historically how America has done it. We didn't become an outlier and kind of just decide we're going to treat everything with just long terms of incarceration. It's still relatively new. It's about a 50-year-old experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think the verdict is in that it hasn't done well. We should be doing
Mm-hmm.
other things. We should try other tactics. But it corresponded with the same era that saw our political landscape changed. And it's just, unfortunately, it does play well into politics and election cycles because,
Which
it's just easier for a politician to deliver something by the next time they see the voters to say, I increased a sentence for something, as opposed to I made these long-term investments that's going to make us all better off in 10 years. But, they're not up for reelection in 10 years. They're up for reelection in 2 or 4. And so it's a bad incentive structure. And it's not just crime that obviously has that characteristic in America. There's all kinds of things we're not great at investing in because, voters are looking for these short-term results
Mhm.
from the people that they elect. And it's unfortunately the case that some things that you need to do that make us all better take a little bit more time than a 2 or 4 year cycle.
I wanted to circle back to your book, Prisoners of Politics. Can you tell us a little bit about, and you just talked about it a little, but why are we so much at the mercy of politics versus why have we been so easily convinced that all of what we've been talking about equates to public safety and that the other things are soft on crime and all the things we've heard?
Yeah. So one thing is just a lot of people don't realize this, but, other countries, America is unique in that we elect our prosecutors, we elect sheriffs in places. And that's not true in most of the rest of the world, because in the rest of the world, there is this sense that, well, you don't really want to put that up to a direct election all the time because voters have a tendency to, they're emotional. A voter can be emotional. And, I'm saying this as a voter. I know I myself have done that. Something gets me riled up and I think about it. So, I think we can all own up to the fact that, and we're not always the most informed. So if you think about all the offices that you vote for, how much do you really know about the area that the person is in charge of and the person themselves and all their policies? And so because voters don't have a lot of information, they use shortcuts to try to figure out how to vote for people. And, politicians figured out, starting with, Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, that, hey,
Mhm.
what works really well politically is if you go out there and you tell people, I'm going to be tough on crime. There's a racialized component to it too, that it sometimes plays into various biases, implicit or otherwise, that people have. But the bottom line is that, politicians for decades have just found that it appeals to voters to seem tough. And even more importantly, at a minimum, what you don't want to be is someone that gets an ad against you where your opponent can show that you did something that seems to make it look like you're the reason someone was victimized. So, the classic example of this, which some of your listeners will remember and others might not know about it, but when Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts, he ran
Really
for
her
president.
important.
Yes,
Yeah.
there was an ad that was George H.W. Bush, his team, Lee Atwater, they ran a campaign ad against Michael Dukakis because when Dukakis was governor, Massachusetts had this furlough program that allowed people who were serving prison terms to go out on weekend passes and kind of be in the community. And the idea behind it was, it would help them eventually when they finish their
Mhm.
term to reintegrate, and so and it had a 99 plus percentage success rate. Like almost everybody who did these weekend passes, it was great. It was actually it was good for them, for their families, for the communities. It did make reentry better. But it just takes one bad example, and that was what the Bush political team realized. There was this guy, Willie Horton, who was on his weekend furlough, and he, brutally raped this woman. And he was already serving a life term for murder, so he was in there for something serious. But he, on furlough, committed this additional horrible, violent crime. And the ad against Michael Dukakis was devastating. Now, different studies say, was it the ad? Was it other things? But I will tell you, every politician since that ad aired has drawn the conclusion that the ad killed Michael Dukakis. So whether it actually did or just perceived to be the case, basically from the time that ad aired, no politician has wanted a similar ad like that against them. And think about what the ad was, right? Dukakis
Right.
wasn't in charge of the furlough program. He probably didn't even know it existed. He just happened to be the governor at the time that Massachusetts had
Mhm.
this thing. And it was a program that was 99% successful. But it didn't matter because you just needed that one ad. And, then he was associated with this idea of coddling criminals. And you can see ads like that. If you Google it, like judicial elections, prosecutorial elections, sheriff, and Congress, president, all of them, every elected official, you see ads like that where basically an opponent tries to paint a picture of the person they're running against as someone who's soft on crime and doesn't care about public safety. And it works. It works with voters. They get scared. They're like, well, oh my gosh, I don't want somebody like that. Now, I do wish people would step back for a minute and ask themselves, do you really think that there's anybody running for office who doesn't want public safety? Like, I mean, maybe there are some, but honestly, I think what we're really talking about is people have different strategies to achieve public safety. But the strategies that involve investing in communities, thinking about longer term solutions, those aren't good political ads. They're just not. I mean, if you tried to run a political ad about that example of the kid with the shooting at the car, you can't do that in 30 seconds. Like, it's just
Right.
not possible. But an opponent can just pick out the worst facts and craft that ad. You could do it right now in 2 minutes. And that has been pernicious for American crime policy, because with the advent of television and televised ads, and with our increasing polarization where people tend to kind of view each other in more tribal terms than they had in the past, it has basically fed into this culture where the Democrats have decided, well, we can't be seen as soft on crime. Look what happened to Dukakis. And so we went for decades with this ratcheting up of sentences. No one would say no because no one wanted to be painted as someone who was soft on crime. I think we have just now in the last decade or so reached a little bit of a turning point, not a huge one, but I think we got to the point where so many people have been incarcerated. So many people have been arrested. If you have 1 in 3 people who have some kind of criminal record, you do get to a point where, from personal experience, I think people say, actually, are we overdoing this? This doesn't seem to actually be calibrated to actually make us safer. It doesn't seem to be working. So I think you have voters now who are a little bit more open to the idea that we should try something else, that this isn't working, that maybe those ads are misleading. You sometimes, I think, hear voters now say, can that really be? Like, what was really happening? So I think there's been a little bit of a shift, but the overall dynamic is still there. And the problem with that is that, if you could really sit down with a voter and say, okay, let me tell you all the facts of this case and this program, I am not sure at the end of that they would say, oh, let's get rid of all furloughs. I think they would say maybe do a better job in how you screen for the furloughs. Maybe some people shouldn't be eligible. But you know what? The furlough program just went away completely, just like parole went away completely, just like all kinds of other things went away completely, because those ads just dictated policy, even though some of these policies actually should stay in place. I mean, we should do more to try to make it so that there aren't mistakes and there aren't harms. But at the end of the day, we want net public safety. And if you having a furlough program means that you stop 99 crimes, even if one happens, you should ask yourself, do you really want to get rid of the whole program? Because it's also saving lives. It's also doing positive things. And we just don't do a good job valuing the positive contributions of things. It's just when the negative thing, that's why you have all kinds of people locked up, pretrial detention. Judges don't want to be accused of having let someone go pretrial. Prosecutors ask for it reflexively all too often because they don't want to be blamed. Like, it's just everyone's trying to avoid blame, and no one's putting any value on what we lose when we do that. And it's not just that, the person who's detained or incarcerated is harmed. We are harmed. The public is harmed because these policies are counterproductive. They make it more likely people are going to reoffend later. And so it's very short-sighted, but there's a lot of things that politically are seen as positives, even though as a matter of public policy, they're terrible. And that is one of them.
Well, it's reminiscent of Lake and Riley. Um, so the Lake and Riley Act, of course, the name was a young woman who was jogging, and she was brutally murdered by someone who was undocumented, and they had a previous misdemeanor shoplifting from 6 months before that. And I had a press conference about it. And I was just thinking about what you said. It is so easy to say, hey, we want to prevent this horrific thing from happening to anyone else. And so we're going to pass this act that's going to make women safer or something like that. And we had a press conference talking about the public safety implications of it with our victims coalition. And we were able to talk about, so domestic violence victims are going to be afraid to come forward. We are going to have a problem getting witnesses, immigrant witnesses to crimes coming forward. People that we want to hold accountable will get deported and we won't be able to. And so we could talk about many different public safety implications, but I've just taken much longer to explain all of that than we want to make sure young women like Laken Riley are protected. And it worked again. We had Democrats voting for that.
Because they don't want, they don't
Right.
want that ad against them, that they don't care about,
Right.
women's safety. And of course they do, we all do.
Right.
But it's hard to explain with a public that has a short attention span. And social media has only made it all worse, because, before, that kind of the Dukakis ad is a time when we're talking about on-air advertisement on TV. Now when you have people that have curated social media feeds, they're really hearing things in their own vacuum, in their bubbles. And so you have to be a kind of, can you get your message through at all? Do you have someone who can even break through to get those people to listen to you at all? Or is everyone just kind of listening to their own people all the time?
So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your new book that's coming out at the beginning of March.
Yeah, so it's kind of the sequel to the first book. So, Prisoner of Politics is about the political dynamics that produce these really perverse policies that make us less safe. How could we end up with that? If it was really true that it would make us less safe, that makes no sense. We shouldn't have them. And I tried to explain, well, actually, the reason we have them is because our political system really isn't set up to reward the best policies. It's set up to reward the best politics. And, it's very different when it comes to criminal law. But one of the things that I had flagged in the book as a possible place to sort of check on this is that, it's not like the framers of our Constitution weren't aware that there were problems with majoritarian politics. They were pretty smart people and they were attuned to this idea that you really couldn't have everything be just whatever the majority wants. And one of the things that they were really focused on was that the public, when it came to crime and punishment, would absolutely go too far if you just had everything be majoritarian rule. And so the Constitution, our Constitution, is really overwhelmingly focused on protections in criminal cases for that reason. Because, and you can look in the Federalist Papers if you're someone who likes history and you want to look at the original documents, but it's really the case that we have a lot of protections against this. And so one of the things I wanted to write about was that, okay, fine, we can expect the political process to go haywire, but what happened to the Constitution? Like, where was the Constitution in all this, given that the framers of our country knew about this? And so this book picks up with that and looks at some Supreme Court cases where, unfortunately, the justices themselves fell victim to the same crime panic arguments, and they just cast the Constitution aside. And, they allowed things to happen that if what we really focused on was the text of the Constitution, its original meaning. I know there's lots of people out there on the more conservative side who really believe, look, you don't have an evolving document. It's what it meant at the time that it says. And these cases are wrong on that basis. Like, if you could wake up a founding father and say, do you know that we detain people pre-trial before they were convicted of a crime just because we are, we're making our own finding that they're dangerous? They would be astonished. I mean, it is so flatly contrary to constitutional protections and what they thought they were putting in there. And so I'm trying to identify those pockets where, if what you cared about was what the Constitution says, what it originally meant, and what case law had said up until the point that the Supreme Court decided the case that they did, you would realize that they took this horrible wrong turn. And as soon as the court took it, it allowed these political impulses to go unchecked. And so it's this perfect, awful storm where there's no check on the process. So, it includes things like pretrial detention because someone's assumed to be dangerous. I mean, I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that, up until the court said that this was okay. And until the Nixon administration went on a campaign to try to get it to be okay in the early 1970s, nobody in America thought that was constitutional. Like everybody agreed you could not detain somebody pretrial just because you thought they were dangerous. Like we have civil commitment proceedings that you could do that, but just because someone was accused of a crime, the idea that that was the basis for locking them up before they had their trial, no one thought that was okay. And yet we have this, the Nixon administration decides, well, let's try to do that. let's try to do that for political points. Ironically, he has his attorney general write a law review article about it. His attorney general, who would later himself be prosecuted, convicted, and go to prison for his role in Watergate. But they come up with this plan to try to basically just change the understanding. And unfortunately, it was really successful. And the Supreme Court goes along with it. And now we have almost 500,000 people in America who are detained before they've ever been found guilty. And it's astounding how quickly the public has just accepted that as okay. But to me, what's even more outrageous is that the court did, because they really should have been the bulwark that said, no, you can't do this. So I have other examples, policing practices where you're allowed to, the police can stop and search somebody even without probable cause. Again, the framers absolutely not. The history is really clear. Overcrowded prison conditions that everyone thought were unlawful. All of a sudden, the court's like, "Oh, who are we to police that?" So there's a whole variety of things. So there's 6 cases in the book, and I hope it'll be of interest to people who care about how we've gone so awry when it comes to punishment in America, but also people who are interested in the Supreme Court, because it is an interesting example that we can hope that the justices will kind of not be subject to the same public safety arguments and kind of things that sway voters. But as it turns out, when you read these cases, you read the justices' papers, you realize actually they're no better than the rest of us when it comes to their ability to really kind of see through that. They get scared, and then when they got scared, it led to this constitutional changing landscape that unfortunately would have prevented a lot of the worst irrationalities, but unfortunately didn't hold.
So I want to end on this. Is there a place where you feel optimistic about reform and public safety?
Well, I think you're an example. I think that I think there are local communities that have experienced the pros and the cons of mass incarceration, of overpunishment, and communities that have experienced it directly know the costs. Like they know that this isn't working well. We need to try something different. And so you are seeing around the country the election of a lot of prosecutors who get that message because their community gets that message. They are elected. People like you are elected because the people in your community have learned that the other approach isn't working, and there's better things to do. And so I think at the local level, there are some real signs for optimism. I unfortunately though, I think it can't. There's only so much you can do. By electing your local prosecutor, it also has to be something you think about when you elect the people who go to Congress and the president and your governor. It's got to be, you shouldn't just be thinking about crime policy when it comes to electing the prosecutor. You got to be thinking like, if I think this isn't working, then what I really need to do is I also need to invest in communities. I need to make it can't just all be about how do we or don't enforce crime. It has to be, how do we stop the crimes from happening in the first place? And a lot of that means investing in things that we know will reduce crime, but that requires you to have a state legislature and a governor or a Congress and a president who understand you can't just slash all funding for things that actually support systems that people need so that they can thrive instead of turning to drugs and emotional instability, mental health problems, a lot of which are tied to a lack of educational, employment, and health opportunities. And if we took care of a lot of those, we would actually save money because we would save all the costs that are associated with all these prison costs and policing costs. But it's a front end investment, and unfortunately, I think sometimes voters don't realize you got to make that front end investment to get the public safety returns later. But I think they're kind of starting to get it with electing prosecutors, and I guess I would just hope that starts to translate into thinking about who gets elected in other positions as well.
Thank you. I'm so glad I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while.
Oh, me too. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.